In the quiet, sun-baked streets of Texas, a sinister darkness simmered beneath the surface. Jason Thornburg, a 44-year-old man with a history of mental instability, lived a life that seemed ordinary to the outside world. His appearance, average at best, belied the monstrous impulses that lurked within him. He had never been able to fully escape his troubled past, a history marred by erratic behavior and disturbing tendencies. For years, Jason Thornburg had existed as a shadow of the man he might have become, isolated, misunderstood, and increasingly volatile. Those who knew him described him as someone who never seemed quite right, though they could never have anticipated the horrors he was about to unleash. Thornburg had been diagnosed with various mental health disorders over the years. Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and personality disorders all seem to intertwine, creating a cocktail of confusion and violence. It was a situation waiting to spiral out of control. Yet, despite these internal battles, he managed to maintain some semblance of normalcy, living in motels, drifting between jobs, and maintaining a quiet presence in the world. But this deceptive calm concealed the storm that was brewing inside his mind. It was in one of these seemingly innocuous motels that Jason Thornburg would enact his most chilling crimes. A place where many travelers sought refuge for a night, unknowingly walking into the lair of a killer. He had become an expert at drawing in vulnerable individuals, those down on their luck, lost or desperate. He offered them companionship, money, and a place to stay, hiding his true intentions behind a mask of normalcy. On one fateful evening, Jason Thornburg's prey entered the motel room. The victims, a man and two women, each with their own burdens and brokenness, had no idea what awaited them. As they made their way into the dingy room, they believed it was just another night of rest. Little did they know it would be their last. Thornburg was meticulous. Every detail had been carefully planned, every move deliberate. He knew what he was about to do. He had done it before, and this time he would make sure no one would stop him. The gruesome events that followed are difficult to comprehend, beyond the reach of human understanding. What had begun as a simple act of manipulation turned into a horrific, unthinkable sequence of events. Jason Thornburg killed his victims with a brutality that shocked even the hardened law enforcement officials who would later investigate the case. Once they were dead, Thornburg went further, performing unspeakable acts of mutilation. He dismembered the bodies with disturbing precision, as if he was methodically trying to erase any trace of humanity from his victims. But that wasn't enough. In his deranged mind, the final act was one of depravity. Cannibalism. Thornburg ate parts of the dismembered bodies, a chilling act that would come to define his sadistic tendencies. For him, it was a grotesque ritual, one that fed his need for control, power, and ultimately his hunger for destruction. No one had been prepared for the horror that lay in the aftermath. It was not long before the bodies were discovered. Neighbors reported foul smells emanating from the room, and when motel management sent someone to investigate, they stumbled upon the aftermath of Jason Thornburg's reign of terror. The scene was incomprehensible. Blood splattered across the walls, severed body parts scattered throughout the room, and the unmistakable stench of death filling the air. Police were immediately called to the scene. What they found inside the room was beyond anything they could have prepared for. The dismembered bodies of the three victims lay strewn across the floor, their remains desecrated in a way that left investigators speechless. There were no words to describe what had been done to them. As they combed through the room, they found more evidence of Thornburg's depravity. He had left a trail of clues behind, almost as if he wanted to be caught. In a bizarre twist, Thornburg had even taken the time to document parts of his actions, leaving behind photographs and personal notes about his victims. His madness had fully consumed him, and he seemed to take pleasure in the terror he had caused. The police quickly identified Thornburg as the prime suspect. His name was already familiar to local law enforcement, who had long suspected that something was off about him. But this was far beyond what anyone had imagined. Thornburg didn't try to run, he didn't hide. In fact, he seemed to be almost eager to face the consequences of his actions. He was arrested at a nearby fast food restaurant, sitting in the parking lot as if nothing had happened. When questioned about the murders, he showed little remorse, speaking in a detached, almost matter-of-fact manner. In his confession, Thornburg revealed chilling details about the murders. He admitted to luring his victims to the motel with promises of shelter and food before overpowering them and carrying out his sickening acts. He spoke of the thrill he felt during the killings, describing them in a way that suggested he saw them as nothing more than an extension of his disturbed fantasies. Thornburg also confessed to 2 additional murders, bringing his total body count to 5. But even as he spoke of his crimes, there was no sense of guilt or regret. Instead, he seemed cold, distant, almost robotic in his responses. The trial of Jason Thornburg was a spectacle, drawing national attention due to the gruesome nature of the crimes and Thornburg's bizarre demeanor during the proceedings. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, from the photographs Thornburg had taken of his victims to the grisly details of the murders themselves. It was clear to everyone that Thornburg was not just a murderer, he was a sadistic predator who took pleasure in inflicting pain and suffering. The defense, however, tried to argue that Thornburg was insane. They pointed to his long history of mental illness, including multiple diagnoses of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. They claimed that his actions were the result of his disturbed mind, unable to differentiate between right and wrong. They painted a picture of a man whose mental state had deteriorated over time, leaving him unable to control his violent impulses. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was overwhelming, and Thornburg's lack of remorse was undeniable. After deliberating for just a few hours, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of all charges. The murder of 3 individuals, along with the dismemberment, cannibalism, and sexual assault of a corpse, was enough to seal his fate. The sentencing phase was just as harrowing. The prosecution called for the death penalty, arguing that Thornburg's actions were too heinous to allow for any chance of rehabilitation. The defense, of course, pleaded for mercy, citing his mental illness as a mitigating factor, but the jury was resolute. They found Jason Thornburg guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and in the end, he was sentenced to death. It was a fitting end for a man who had shown no respect for life, no remorse for his actions. Jason Thornburg's case became one of the most chilling and talked about criminal cases in Texas history. The brutality of his murders, combined with his cold, calculating demeanor, left an indelible mark on everyone who followed the trial. Though he was sentenced to death, the question of whether justice was truly served remains. Thornburg's defense argued that his mental illness should have been taken into account, and some still believe that he may never have fully understood the gravity of his actions. But for the families of his victims, the trial and sentencing offered a measure of closure. Thornburg sits on death row today, awaiting his ultimate fate, but his legacy remains a grim reminder of the horrors that can hide in plain sight. The man who once seemed so ordinary became one of the most notorious criminals in recent history. A man whose darkness could no longer be concealed. As for the victims, their lives were tragically cut short, their names forever associated with the horrors of that motel room. And while Jason Thornburg may have tried to erase their humanity, their memory endures. The question remains, how many others like him walk among us, hiding in plain sight, their darkness just waiting to surface? The true horror of Jason Thornburg's crimes may not lie in the past, but in the chilling realization that there may be others who have yet to be discovered.